Now let's move on to an important function of the kidney that students often forget about, the hormones. There are 4 important hormones secreted by the kidney. 3 of them are endocrine hormones, meaning that they act where? At distant sites. And the 4th is a paracrine hormone, meaning that it acts where? Locally. So the first is erythropoietin. When the kidneys sense hypoxia, the interstitial fibroblasts near the peritubular capillaries release erythropoietin into the bloodstream. This then goes to the bone marrow, where it then stimulates the production of more red blood cells. This is a very relevant fact for your exam, since this process can be significantly altered in the context of a renal cell carcinoma. And we'll go into more detail about these cancers later on, but just to give you a heads up, these cancers can secrete erythropoietin in an uncontrolled fashion even if there's no hypoxia. So that may be one of the first ways that this cancer is detected, which is an elevated hematocrit due to the EPO. The next important renal hormone is activated vitamin D. Inactivated vitamin D is synthesized in the skin, or it can be eaten and taken up through the gut. But the kidney and the liver are needed to convert it to an active form. First, 25-alpha hydroxylase in the liver converts it to 25-hydroxy vitamin D before the kidneys can convert it to 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is the active form. Now, do you remember the enzyme in the kidneys that is responsible for this conversion? It's 1-alpha hydroxylase. In the kidney, parathyroid hormone stimulates the production of 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D, and this leads to increased intestinal absorption of calcium and decreased phosphate absorption. It also increases renal calcium reabsorption and decreases phosphate reabsorption. Now, a clinically relevant note is that renal failure can lead to decreased production of vitamin D and subsequent bone problems, and this is called renal osteodystrophy. The third important renal hormone is renin, which we've already talked about, but just remember that it's an important regulator of blood pressure through which system? The RAS system. Next we have a paracrine hormone, which belongs to a group of hormones called prostaglandins. This picture is an example of a prostaglandin, and they are synthesized from arachidonic acid. Like we said before, these act locally, and an example is PGE2, which causes afferent arterial dilation, vasodilation, and this leads to an increase in the GFR in the kidney. Now, this is also important clinically because NSAIDs, which inhibit prostaglandin synthesis, can lead to vasoconstriction of the afferent arterioles and subsequent acute or even chronic renal failure because the kidneys will not be able to properly filter the blood if the GFR is reduced. And constriction of the afferent arterioles can also cause papillary necrosis and chronic interstitial nephritis due to reduced blood flow. One more important function of the kidney, just so we can be comprehensive, is a function that you may remember from biochemistry. It's that the kidney can perform gluconeogenesis. And it converts lactate and glutamine into glucose. Now let's conclude our discussion of hormones by discussing where they act in the kidney. So let's say we have our glomerulus here, and blood is coming in through the afferent arteriole and exiting through the efferent arteriole. Now some hormones are secreted from other parts of the body but act on the kidney, such as atrial natriuretic peptide. And this is important, ANP, because the rest of the body needs to communicate to the kidney the body's volume status and solute concentrations. AMP is secreted by the heart, in response to increased atrial pressure, and this causes increased GFR by dilating the afferent arteriole without a compensatory increase in sodium reabsorption, and this leads to sodium and water loss, bringing the blood volume back down. Another hormone, parathyroid hormone, increases the serum calcium and decreases the serum phosphate levels, like we said before. And it does this by acting at the proximal and distal tubules, as well as in the gut, where calcium and phosphate absorption are affected. Now this is actually the opposite of another hormone called calcitonin, a hormone secreted by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland that actually acts to decrease serum calcium levels. Now we covered angiotensin II in the discussion about the RAS system previously, but just remember that angiotensin II constricts the efferent arteriole and increases sodium reabsorption in the proximal and distal nephron. The last one is aldosterone. And aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption in the collecting tubule. Now, quick question: how is aldosterone function linked to ADH secretion? Now remember that aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption, and this will increase plasma osmolarity, which will then stimulate the secretion of ADH. And then ADH will stimulate increased water reabsorption to restore plasma osmolarity. So you see how aldosterone and ADH are working together to increase the blood volume, both the solutes and the water. So as you see, the kidney is more than just a filter for the blood. This is why some of the renal pathology that we'll get into later on can be so devastating, and why damage to the kidneys is a serious cause for concern in the hospital. Now let's talk about potassium shifts. The way I remember the causes of hypokalemia, where potassium may be shifting into the cell, is with the example of a lion that kills and eats its prey. As the lion is sprinting for the prey, its adrenergic system is activated. This activates the sodium-potassium ATPases, shifting potassium into all of the cells in the body. Then, when the lion is eating its prey, insulin is released, which also activates the sodium-potassium ATPase. Remember that insulin shifts K into cells. So the IN in insulin, think K into cells. Now this is actually desirable for the lion because the lion is eating its prey, which is a huge potassium load due to large amounts of potassium being inside the cells of the prey. So shifting potassium into the cells of the lion protects the lion from becoming hyperkalemic when eating the prey. Another stimulus that shifts potassium into the cells is alkalosis. Alkalosis, such as respiratory alkalosis at high altitudes. Alkalosis stimulates the potassium-hydrogen exchanger to pump hydrogen ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell, causing a minor hypokalemia. And finally, hypoosmolarity causes potassium to flow into the cell because as water moves into the cell, potassium flows with it. Now the stimuli that shift potassium out of the cells, so out of the cells now, will be the opposite of what I just mentioned. Insulin deficiency, beta-adrenergic agonist, acidosis, hyperosmolarity, which will shift potassium out of cells, digitalis, which blocks the sodium ATPase, and this causes potassium concentration to build up outside of the cells, and finally cell lysis, such as during trauma, which causes the release of high concentrations of potassium into the plasma. Now let's look at the effects of disturbances in concentrations of potassium as well as other electrolytes. Let's begin with sodium. The role of sodium in neurons is critical for depolarization and action potentials. So it makes sense that if you have low sodium, you will have problems generating action potentials, and this could manifest as a number of neurological problems, including stupor and malaise and coma. So what would high concentrations of sodium cause? They might cause overexcitation of neurons, causing irritability and delirium. Potassium disturbances are important because they can lead to arrhythmias. The shape of the T wave follows the potassium concentration because potassium flowing out of the cardiomyocytes is what repolarizes them during the T wave. So low potassium concentrations will have flattened T waves, and high potassium concentrations will have peaked T waves. What about calcium? Low calcium concentration can lead to tetany because calcium is required for excitation-contraction coupling in skeletal muscle. How about high calcium concentrations? It can cause things like renal stones, bone pain, abdominal pain, and altered mental status. I like to remember this with the saying, stones, bones, groans, and psychic overtones. Next we have magnesium. Low magnesium concentration can cause torsade de pointe, and high magnesium concentration can cause decreased deep tendon reflexes, lethargy, as well as cardiac electrical dysfunction. Next, phosphate. Low phosphate concentration leads to bone loss and osteomalacia because phosphate is required for hydroxyapatite formation in the bone. And high phosphate concentration will lead to renal stones, metastatic calcifications, and hypocalcemia. Let's try a flash quiz. What are the effects of prostaglandins on the glomerulus? The answer is prostaglandins cause dilation of the afferent arteriole and an increased GFR. Remember that prostaglandins act locally as paracrine hormones in the kidney, and that NSAIDs will lead to constriction of the afferent arteriole.